Alright, here we go. Good evening, my name is George SHIBLEY, and this is a presentation on an analysis that I did of mental illness and unemployment from a paid survey. This is just a quick outline of the presentation. I'm not really going to go through it, but it's just normal case study report outline. So, to go into the background and motivation behind looking at unemployment and mental illness, I found this organization, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They're the largest grassroots mental health organization in the United States, and part of what they do, among other things, is support and conduct research to help those suffering from mental illness. According to a research report issued by NAMI in 2014, one of the best steps in recovery from mental illness is a job, but the national unemployment rate for individuals receiving public mental health services is approximately 80%, which is troubling and really just the tip of the iceberg. That report further shows this, by the graph indicated in it, that there was a decline in employment rates for those who have mental health issues and receiving services from the government. That essentially went down from 23% in 2003 to 17.8% in 2012. And, things don't really stop there. This is just a look at the unemployment rate by state, and we can also look at how each state ranks. We didn't even find anything, or I didn't really even find anything that was that impressive. The lowest unemployment rate was just about 56% in Wyoming, with the highest unemployment rate being 93% in Maine, and that's bad. One final point to mention, perhaps the most enlightening and disturbing in the report, is that even during the Great Recession, where everyone was losing their jobs, the national unemployment rate then paled next to what people in the public mental health system routinely experience. So, about a year ago, Michael Corley, a data scientist at Sigma Data Science, produced a paid research survey to explore the linkage between mental illness and unemployment. Even though the group NAMI has conducted multiple surveys verifying the high unemployment rate among those with a mental illness, this is the only survey to date which targets causation, why individuals are unemployed. With NAMI's goal of improving our understanding behind these trends, so that we can address the issue more efficiently publicly, I'd like the opportunity to assist by investigating the following questions about mental illness and unemployment. The first is there a relationship between the gap in one's resume and their chances of being employed? The second is there a relationship between the gaps in one's resume and their experience with mental illness? What impact, for the third question, what impact do symptoms and side effects have on one's chances of being predicted as employed? Excuse me. And fourth, what are the top 8 factors that contribute to being predicted as unemployed? So, to find some statistical methods that I could use to answer some of those questions, I looked to some literature, some academic literature. The first article that I have, Do We Need Hundreds of Classifiers to Solve Real-World Classification Problems, basically assessed 17 different classifying methods to answer, different issues. And really, this was just to see if there was one that stood out in general from the other. And I found that random forest performed pretty well compared to all the other methods, just for about every scenario. And I'm going to be in a situation with my data set where I can set up classification models to answer some of my questions, so I'm going to use random forest to do that. Another article I found, Correlates of Long-Term Unemployment Among Inner-City Adults with Serious and Persistent Mental Illness, by Richard Goldberg. In here, he explored some of these correlates using multiple linear regression. These are with similar variables to what I have, and so I'd also like to use multiple linear regression for my analysis. The last article, Do More of Those in Misery Suffer from Poverty, Unemployment, or Mental Illness? They explored these linkages. Richard Laird and Sarah Fleisch, they used logistic regression in order to do this rather successfully, so I'm going to end up doing that as well, also because they have similar variables to me. I find it appropriate that I could apply this method here also. And with that being said, I really only described 4 methods that I'm going to use: logistic regression, linear regression, random forest, and multiple logistic regression. Aside from that, it should be noted that also with all 4 methods, I'm going to be using a 70-30 train test split. So, looking at the data set, the description, the cleaning, and the pre-processing that happened, well, this data set comes from Kaggle. Its sample size is 334. The proportion of individuals in it with mental illness is similar to that of the population at about 20 to 25%. The variables within this data set, they show basic descriptive characteristics, quality of life, mental health characteristics, and aspects of job and education history. There's a total of 31 variables, and to answer the different questions that I have, I'm going to extract various subsets of the data set. Here is just a quick before and after of some of the cleaning and pre-processing I did. I changed lengthy variable names. I had to change some variable formats. A lot of switching variables to factor formats. And I also had to rename and reorder the levels of education and household income group factor variables. There were some missing values as well. If the observation had NAs for a factor variable, the observation was simply omitted. For NA observations on continuous variables, those were imputed with a moving average. In the end, this resulted in a slightly smaller data set, going from 348 observations to 293. So from there, I performed an exploratory data analysis just to look at some questions that I could answer outside of using statistical modeling. The first being is, how are individuals with mental illness stratified across household income and annual income? And essentially, if you have a mental illness, as indicated by the box plot here on the right, or whether you are in the cyan color group here, for these bar charts here, for these different categories of household income group, you'll find that individuals who have mental illness are making less money and are in lower household income groups. And if we basically apply the same question, but set up the same question, but look at individuals who have been hospitalized for mental illness, because you could have a mental illness, but not necessarily be hospitalized, and that could be something more serious. It's the same trend. If you have that if you happen to have that experience in your life, you're on average making less income than those who haven't and are in a lower household income group. I also wanted to look at how individuals with mental illness are stratified across education level. Nothing really stood out here, although I would have liked a little bit more data to explore this further. But I found similar ratios of people with and without mental illness on the lower and higher ends in terms of educational experience. But the one last thing I want to look at is how many individuals with mental illness in the data set were employed versus unemployed. In general, there were, if you were classified as having a mental illness, there are obviously a smaller percentage of individuals employed. Those who are unemployed, there's a higher percent. Moving on to the questions that I wanted to answer with statistical analysis. So the first one was looking at predicting employment using resume gap and also using resume gap length. I did 2 separate models for this and found that both the predictors, so resume gap predicting employed now and resume gap length predicting employed now, those are both significant. The test error rate for just whether you have, for the model that with the predictor resume gap, which is whether you have a gap or not, that test error rate was at 31%. And when looking at the model that contains the resume gap length, which is a numeric variable, test error rate was even lower at about 30%. Just to be a little bit thorough, the second model in this first question, I wanted to see if there's a linear relationship between the logic of the outcome and resume gap length, the predicted value. This is just checking assumptions, and it appears to be clearly linear, so I'm not too concerned about my trust in the output from question 1 here. I have faith in these results. But question 2, this is using multiple linear regression to explore the relationships between symptoms and resume gap length. We see some significant variables, right? A pretty low R-square with only 12.5% variation in the response variable being explained by these predictors. I have a test MSE of 423. It's standalone, so future trials need to aim for just a lower score than this and a higher R-squared value. And I'm kind of speeding through this output here to show you this output. It's because although there were significant variables that were symptoms, I don't have a lot of confidence in the model because I see an assumption violation. The multi-collinearity issues, I don't see anything there. The VIF table shows all the values are under 10. But the diagnostic plot leads me to believe the normality assumption in the residuals is violated, and that's shown by this wonky line not really fitting too well with this line in the QQ plot. So because of that, I'm not nearly as trusting in the results here and feel that I should move on. The results from question 3. So this was looking at predicting whether or not you were employed by assessing the symptoms, side effects, and people who experience them. I did that first with a random forest. The test error rate from that random forest is about 31%. We see that the variable importance plot indicates that panic attacks, mood swings, and anxiety were important for classifying individuals as employed. I thought this was interesting just because if you have any experience with those symptoms or know anyone who does, you might find that many of those could be related. When I also looked at the same question and just used logistic regression instead, excuse me, this output indicated that mood swings, as well as being hospitalized for mental illness, were significant predictors for classifying individuals as employed. And I included hospitalized for mental illness because while it might not be a specific symptom, you're going to be somebody who has symptoms, so you can at least use that for interpretability's sake. The prediction performance was about 32% for a test error rate on the logistic regression, a little bit higher than the random forest. There were no numeric predictors in there, so I didn't look at the logic of the outcome for violations of the linearity assumption. And also the VIF values for looking at multicollinearity. Those were all under 10. There was nothing really concerning there. Going to the final question, and this was just finding the top 8 factors that contribute to being predicted as unemployed. First, using random forest, the test error rate, this is the lowest one I've gotten from any model for any question, was about 15%. We also see the variable importance plot indicates that variables like household income, resume gap length, education, and disability were important for classifying people as employed. We also see that hospitalization for mental illness can also be important. I'm going to go through this real quickly. The results of the modeling question 4 with logistic regression. There were some significant relationships in here identified. These include variables related to education, household income, age, age, and there was also standalones like panic attacks, mood swings, and a few others. The test error rate for this model was slightly above 20%. Which is also slightly higher than the random forest approach. However, looking at the assumption checks that I have here, first looking at multicollinearity, there's nothing really concerning with any of these values here. But if I'm looking at the logic of the outcome and numeric predictors, looking at relationships, trying to find if any of these are linear, a lot of these do not look linear, and I don't really think I can trust the logistic regression model's output. So what does this all boil down to when exploring the linkage between unemployment and mental illness? Well, we had 4 questions to explore this, and with those models we also had 4 answers. The first is there a relationship between the gap in one's resume and their chances of being unemployed? And the answer is yes. Essentially, your chances will be negatively influenced if you have a resume gap, and furthermore, the bigger that gap is, the worse your chances are. The second question, is there a relationship between the gap in one's resume and their experience with mental illness? So looking at things like symptoms and side effects, those were inconclusive results. There needs to be more methods trialed to find something that can be a little bit more trustworthy. The multiple linear regression model had an assumption violation, so I couldn't really use it. The last 2 questions, what impact do symptoms and side effects have on one's chances of being predicted as employed? We looked at random forest and logistic regression, and in general there were 2 predictors that stood out in both of those models' results, and that was being hospitalized for mental illness and mood swings. Both of those were negatively related to the odds of being predicted as employed. And finally, the last question is, what were the top 8 factors that contribute to being predicted as unemployed? The logistic regression model for this question did not turn out to be useful. The random forest helped me produce this output, which is that the top 8 factors are frequency of being hospitalized for mental illness, resume gap length, age, being legally disabled, your household income group, your level of education, being unable to focus, and the type of device you own, like Mac, Android, iOS, that kind of a thing. And that is the end of the presentation. In general, it does collectively seem like people who have mental illness or experience with it are having harder times finding jobs and are also in a lower income group or making less money. So hopefully this can provide further evidence that can be used to inspire others to produce programs, social programs that can maybe address this issue or these issues. I really appreciate you for taking the time to listen. Thank you very much.